The air inside Judge Thomas's private chambers felt heavier than the Ouagadougou heat outside. Mahogany walls, polished to a mirror shine, held the smell of old cigars and older deals. 3 men sat in the cool hum of the air conditioning, their voices low, like conspirators in a play they'd rehearsed too many times. At the head of the table, Thomas adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, fingers tapping a folder marked Confidential. Across from him, the French lawyer Dubois slid a thick envelope forward, the kind that never saw daylight. "The mining contracts stay intact," Dubois said, his voice sharp as glass. Thomas didn't blink. "They will," he replied. A third man, Sankara, a local politician with more fear than power, shifted uneasily in his leather chair. "Judge, the people love him. If we push too hard—" Thomas's gavel cracked against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "The people," he said, "don't understand international law, but they'll learn. Out in the main." Hall, the sound of a restless crowd seeped under the door. Reporters setting up cameras, diplomats murmuring in tight clusters, ordinary citizens drawn by the scent of history in the air. Thomas rose, straightened his black robes, and glanced at his reflection in the tall window. Below, the market was waking up. Stalls bursting with color, children chasing each other toward school. He knew in 2 hours, none of it would feel the same. Dubois gathered his briefcase, already smug. "500 million in fines, enough to starve any revolution." Thomas's mouth curved, but not in kindness. "Then it's settled." Outside, the courthouse steps were a living tide, flags of red, green, and yellow waving high under the morning sun. President Ibrahim Traoré climbed from a modest government vehicle, ignoring the armored SUV his advisors had urged on him. His uniform was crisp but humble. Children who should have been in class were pressed against the barricades, chanting his name. He slowed, placed a hand over his heart, and looked up at the colonial-era courthouse, a building older than his country's independence. "Today," he murmured to his aide, "we face the ghosts." Inside, the marble corridors echoed with whispers. European diplomats gathered in quiet corners, eyes watchful. Local journalists darted forward, cameras snapping, their lenses drinking in the moment. Ibrahim's security moved like shadows around him, but he walked with steady, unhurried steps. At the heavy courtroom doors, he paused. His legal team drew close, but he gave them only one instruction. "Whatever happens, we speak only truth." The courtroom fell to a hush when he entered. Judge Thomas sat high above, robes flowing, his face carved from stone. The public gallery was packed, every seat filled, some eyes full of hope, others heavy with doubt. Ibrahim took his place without ceremony, refusing to stand for the formality. Beside him, his lawyer, Fatou, leaned in with last-minute updates, but his attention never left the man on the bench. He wasn't just reading a judge's face, he was reading the whole game. And the game was about to begin. The first strike of the gavel cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. Then another, and another. Judge Thomas leaned forward on the bench, his robe falling in heavy folds, his eyes scanning the room like a man about to claim a prize. "This court is now in session." The words hung in the air, heavy as iron. President Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. No flinch, no fidget. He'd seen worse than this: palace betrayals, midnight assassination attempts, the cold weight of foreign pressure pressing down on his country's back. This was just another battle. Thomas began to read the charges, drawing them out like an executioner savoring the moment before the blade falls. Ibrahim closed his eyes for a heartbeat, whispering a prayer not for himself, but for the millions outside these walls who would feel the weight of whatever came next. The gallery leaned forward, every head tilted toward the judge. "President Traoré," Thomas said, drawing the name out like a warning. This court finds you in violation of international mining agreements signed by your predecessors. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Those agreements were the very chains that had bled the country dry for decades. Everyone knew it. Everyone also knew this trial wasn't about law, it was about power. Thomas's tone hardened. The penalties are severe and non-negotiable. At the front of the room, the French lawyer Dubois allowed himself the faintest smile, already dreaming of profit sheets in Paris. A few diplomats adjusted their seats, pens ready to record what they believed would be a turning point in their favor. Then Thomas lifted a stack of papers as if raising a weapon. This court orders punitive damages in the amount of... He paused, savoring the silence. 500 million US dollars. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as people stood. $500 million. An amount designed not for justice, but to break a nation's back. Camera flashes popped like lightning over the savannah. Thomas banged his gavel again and again, forcing the noise back into submission. Then he twisted the knife. Failure to pay within 30 days will result in asset seizure and international sanctions. A perfect trap. Centuries of extraction and exploitation wrapped in the language of law. But across the room, the man at the center of it all hadn't moved. Ibrahim sat like stone, the verdict hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. And then slowly, he stood. The sound in the room died instantly. There was something in his movement, measured, unhurried, but carrying the weight of history that pulled every gaze toward him. Even the court stenographer froze mid-sentence. Thomas expected panic, maybe pleading, but what he got instead was the steady, unshaken stare of a leader who'd already decided he would not bow. In the diplomats section, unease began to creep in. Their show trial was suddenly slipping from script. When Ibrahim finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it rolled through the room with the slow power of distant thunder. And in that moment, everyone understood. This fight was far from over. The room was still vibrating from the echo of the verdict when Ibrahim's voice cut through, low but steady. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Thomas hesitated. He had been prepared for protest, maybe even begging. But there was something in the young president's tone, a quiet confidence that didn't fit the role of the condemned man. "You may," Thomas said, masking the flicker of doubt in his voice. Ibrahim didn't turn toward the bench. Instead, he stepped forward, toward the gallery, toward his people. The marble floor carried the sound of each step like a drumbeat. Sunlight from the high windows stretched his shadow long across the tiles, as if the ancestors themselves were walking with him. $500 million, he said, his voice filling the hall. "And for what crime? For putting my people before the profits of men who will never set foot on our soil?" A stir went through the crowd. Even some diplomats sat a little straighter. "This is not justice," he went on. "This is the old game. Sovereignty traded away for scraps, slavery disguised as partnership." Judge Thomas gripped his gavel, but the sharp bang that followed did nothing to slow the momentum building in the room. Ibrahim placed both hands on the defense table, leaning forward until his gaze locked with Thomas's. "Before you destroy a nation with the stroke of your pen, perhaps we should talk about the real criminals in this room." The silence was absolute. From his jacket, Ibrahim pulled a thick folder. Dubois, the French lawyer, went pale. "These," Ibrahim said, holding the folder high, "are records of what has been stolen from us, not in weeks, not in years, but for generations." He flipped it open. Papers spilled across the table. Mining contracts signed in secret, satellite images of stripped land, water reports marked hazardous. The air in the room shifted. "These agreements," Ibrahim said, his voice rising, "were never about development. They were about theft. $2 billion taken from our soil while our children drink from poisoned rivers. The gallery erupted. Gasps, angry shouts, the scrape of chairs as people rose to their feet. Thomas pounded his gavel again and again, his voice straining to restore order. Dubois stood, pointing a trembling hand. "Those are classified." "Classified," Ibrahim cut in, "to hide the truth from the very people who own the gold." Beneath their feet. He held up a photograph. Scorched earth, a dead river, children carrying buckets of muddy water. The image landed like a blow. Reporters scribbled furiously. Diplomats whispered into phones. And for the first time that morning, it wasn't Judge Thomas controlling the courtroom. It was Ibrahim. The courtroom was no longer under Judge Thomas's control. The air was charged, the noise rising like a storm at sea. Journalists' pens flew across their notepads. They knew this wasn't just a trial anymore. It was the unmasking of something far bigger, a rot that ran from the streets of Ouagadougou to the boardrooms of Paris. Diplomats whispered urgently in tight circles, faces pale, as if the walls had been stripped away and the world outside could finally see their game. Ibrahim stood at the center, steady as a mountain. "These," he said, sweeping his hand over the spread of documents, "are the crimes that should be on trial today. Theft dressed up as investment, plunder, legalized by paperwork." Page after page lay across the table. Contracts, bank, statements, photographs, each one a brick in the monument of corruption now towering in front of the public. The crowd roared his name. Others shouted demands for answers from the diplomatic benches, their carefully cultivated composure beginning to crack. Dubois, the French lawyer, tried to gather his papers, desperate to retreat. But Ibrahim's voice pinned him in place. "Your Honor," he said, turning back to Thomas, "this court has no moral right to condemn a people for defending their freedom." The words hit like a hammer blow. For a moment, Thomas looked almost small. Then Ibrahim pulled out a single page, stamped with an official seal, and the judge's color drained away. "Perhaps," Ibrahim said, "we should talk about your own stake in the Kouri gold mine." The room froze. Dubois' hands moved in frantic signals toward the bench, but the damage was done. Ibrahim read aloud the bank records. Monthly transfers, $50,000 at a time, flowing straight into Thomas's private company. The gallery erupted again, the noise rattling the old colonial windows. Reporters scribbled faster. Phones lit up. As photographs of Thomas's lavish Virginia estate began circulating online, Fatou, Ibrahim's lawyer, rose to her feet. "Motion to dismiss on grounds of judicial conflict of interest," she shouted over the din. On the bench, Thomas's face was rigid, his knuckles white as he clung to the edge of the desk. The man who had been in command minutes earlier now looked like a defendant himself. More evidence came. Proof of kickbacks, property deals, luxury, purchases paid for by the very corporations that had drained Burkina Faso's soil dry. The judge's gavel slammed down again and again, but the sound no longer carried authority. "These proceedings are out of order," he barked. Nobody listened. Dubois snapped his briefcase shut, abandoning his ally like a sinking ship. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught every bead of sweat on Thomas's brow. Even the court officers hesitated, unsure whether to obey the commands of a man whose mask had been ripped away before the entire nation. And then Thomas stood, his black robes billowing, not with dignity, but with the frantic energy of someone who knows the walls are closing in. The judge's finger jabbed toward Ibrahim, his voice cracking under the strain. "You can't prove any of this," he shouted. But the papers on the table told a different story. They sat there in plain view, each one a silent witness to years of corruption. The people in the gallery, teachers, miners, vendors, students, stared down at the man they once thought spoke for justice. Their faces burned with betrayal. Ibrahim didn't flinch. He stood rooted in calm certainty, while the judges, power drained away. "The only criminal in this courtroom," he said, voice steady, "is the one wearing the robe." A ripple moved through the crowd. Then an elderly woman in bright traditional dress rose to her feet. She raised her hands high and shouted, "Liar! Thief!" Her voice was ragged, but carried the force of decades of pain. That was the spark. The whole room surged to its feet, a wall of voices crashing over the judge's desperate banging of the gavel. Court officers exchanged uneasy looks. Some stood frozen. Others simply removed their caps, unwilling to shield a man whose guilt now hung in the air like smoke. "Down with corrupt judges! Down with thieves!" The chant began, spreading row by row until it filled the chamber. Phones went up. Live streams began pouring out to the world. Burkina Faso's people weren't just watching history, they were making it. In the corner, diplomats huddled together like hunted animals, their careful plans crumbling under the roar of a newly awakened public. Dubois, the French lawyer, tried to slip toward the door, but was blocked by citizens who recognized his face from Ibrahim's evidence. An old miner, his hands rough and scarred from decades underground, stepped forward. His finger shook as he pointed straight at the bench. "You took the gold from under our feet. Now you want to take our leader too." His words cut the noise, like a blade. Market women began ululating, half celebration, half battle cry. It was no longer just anger, it was liberation. Even the judge's own law clerk walked out, her resignation wordless but unmistakable. The chamber itself seemed to tremble. What had begun as a colonial courtroom now felt like a public square, a place where truth had broken through walls that once seemed unshakable. Children peered over the railing, wide-eyed, as they watched their parents and grandparents stand up to power in a way they'd never seen before. Ibrahim didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The people had found their voice, and it filled the air like a storm, breaking after years of drought. Judge Thomas clutched his gavel like a lifeline, but it was useless now. The black robe was no shield against the moral weight pressing down on him. And outside, the sound of the crowd was growing, proof that this moment had already escaped. The courtroom. The uprising had begun. "Order!" the judge bellowed, but the command died in the roar of the crowd. His gavel sat useless on the bench, like a broken weapon in the hands of a man who'd already lost the war. The bailiffs had given up trying to quiet anyone. Some even nodded along with the chants bouncing off the old stone walls. Thomas's robe, once a symbol of fear and authority, now looked more like a costume, a relic from an era that was ending right in front of him. Sweat trickled down his face. His eyes darted from the doors to the windows, searching for an escape that wasn't there. "Security! Clear this room!" he shouted. But the head of security, a broad-shouldered Burkinabe named Usman, didn't move. Arms crossed, jaw set, he stared up at the bench. "We protect justice, not thieves," he said. That was the end of it. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. The diplomats scrambled toward the exits, only to find their path blocked by citizens demanding answers. Thomas's shelves of law books loomed behind him, silent reminders of a justice he'd twisted for profit. "This is contempt of court," he cried, but the people only laughed, not with humor, but with the deep, knowing laughter of those who've suffered under the lie for too long. Ibrahim sat still, letting the noise swell around him. The market women's ululations mingled with the revolutionary songs of students, until the walls themselves seemed to shake. On the bench, the judge's papers scattered like dry leaves, carried away by a wind of change he could no longer control. His elevated seat had become a stage of shame, making his fall all the more visible. The chants shifted. "Confess your crimes." First one voice, then dozens, then hundreds. The judge looked toward the door, but Dubois was long gone. He was alone now, abandoned even by his allies. Then Ibrahim rose. The noise fell away to silence. The crowd parted as he walked forward, slow and steady, like a commander crossing a battlefield after victory. Thomas shrank back, his high desk suddenly a cage. "Your Honor," Ibrahim said, the words dripping with deliberate irony, "I think it's time you stepped down." The sunlight caught Ibrahim's face, leaving Thomas in shadow. The message was clear. The room exploded in cheers. The people had taken back their court. The air inside the courtroom was electric. Ibrahim's words still hung in the rafters like a rolling storm, and the people seized them as their own. "Come down! Face us!" The chant rose, not just as a legal demand, but as something far older, a deep, human cry for justice. Up on the bench, Judge Thomas clung to the wood as if it could save him. The titles, the training, the fine suits, none of it mattered now. The crowd had stopped seeing him as a judge. They saw him for what he was. The security detail stepped aside. There would be no shield between him and the people today. Ibrahim stood at the foot of the bench, eyes burning with pride and purpose. His voice cut through the silence. "You wanted to fine me $500 million, he said. "But you can't put a price on freedom." That was all it took. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a tidal wave of truth. "Guilty!" they shouted. "Guilty of stealing! Guilty of betraying justice!" The accusations came fast, each one hitting its mark. Thomas's black robe sagged on his shoulders, no longer a sign of authority, just a costume for a part he could no longer play. Ibrahim took a step toward the bench. Thomas flinched. Another step, and the fear in the judge's eyes was plain for all to see. "This court still answers to me!" Thomas barked, pointing his gavel like a weapon. Ibrahim didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You were never our judge," he said. "You were their puppet." The words hit harder than any blow. The gavel slipped from Thomas's hand and clattered to the floor, the sound of an empire cracking. In that moment, the roles were reversed. Ibrahim stood where judgment was handed down, not as a defendant, but as the voice of a nation reclaiming itself. Somewhere in the chaos, Thomas slipped out a back door, leaving behind his robe, his power, and the illusion that had kept him aloft for years. The sun streamed through the tall windows, bathing the room in gold. The people sang victory songs that had echoed after battles long past. Children clung to their parents, sensing they were part of a day their grandchildren would one day hear about. Outside, words spread like fire on dry grass. The $500 million fine was forgotten, as useless as the corrupt system that wrote it. Women in the market ululated until their voices cracked. Students waved the red, green, and yellow high in the bright, morning air. Diplomatic cars slunk away down side streets, the men inside whispering into phones about plans gone to ruin. What began as a trial had ended as a reckoning, and the people had won. The heat of the midday sun beat down on Ouagadougou, but the air outside the courthouse was electric. Ibrahim stepped through the doors, not into silence or fear, but into a sea of faces, thousands of them, beaming with pride. They weren't just cheering for a man, they were celebrating a victory for an entire nation. The journalists who had flown in expecting to witness his humiliation now scrambled to capture a very different story. Instead of a political fall, they were watching the unraveling of a scheme that had been designed to rob Burkina Faso of its wealth. Those untouchable mining contracts, now exposed as nothing more than a paper mask for theft. From the courthouse steps, Ibrahim spoke. No grand theatrics, just a voice steady and full of conviction. "Today," he said, "we proved that our freedom is not for sale." It was the kind of sentence that lands deep in the heart, like a prayer answered after years of waiting. People wept. Others danced. Children waved handmade flags, weaving through the crowd, their laughter mixing with the chants of their elders. In that moment, the courthouse, once a cold symbol of foreign control, had been reclaimed. It now stood for something far greater: truth over lies, justice over greed. The so-called $500 million trap had crumbled, and what emerged was worth far more: an unshakable sense of dignity, sovereignty, and the proof that corruption can be beaten. This was no ordinary legal win. It was a turning point, one that would echo in every town and village of Burkina Faso. And somewhere, in a dusty drawer, the gavel of a corrupt judge would sit forgotten. But the words spoken that day would live on, carried in the hearts of a people who refused to be broken. Ibrahim Traoré had done more than win a case. He had rewritten the future. What would you have done if you stood in his place? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you believe in stories of courage that reshape history, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what's coming next.